Somewhere in the frozen depths of a Soviet military bunker, a small group of officers sat with their fingers, metaphorically, terrifyingly, hovering at the end of the world. They weren't waiting for orders. They weren't waiting for a phone call. They were waiting for something far worse: silence. Because if the phones stopped ringing, if the radio signals went dark, if Moscow simply stopped responding, then the system would assume one thing: that everyone was already dead, and it would launch everything, automatically, without any human being giving the final command. No president, no general, no last-minute moment of sanity, just a machine doing what it was built to do. This wasn't science fiction. This wasn't a Cold War fever dream. This was real. And for decades, almost nobody in the Western world knew it existed. The Cold War didn't end cleanly. Most people know the broad strokes. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Two superpowers stared each other down across decades of nuclear terror, and somehow, barely, chose not to pull the trigger. A tidy story, a lucky escape, a history textbook exhale. But that version leaves out some of the most extraordinary and most disturbing chapters ever written in the history of human civilization. Chapters that weren't confirmed, weren't declassified, not even fully believed until years after the Cold War officially ended. And when those files finally came out, when the former Soviet officers finally started talking, when the historians finally pieced together what had actually been happening inside those concrete walls and underground command posts, the picture that emerged wasn't relief, it was horror, it was admiration, and it was the nauseating realization that the world had come far, far closer to annihilation than anyone wanted to admit. This is the story of 3 moments, 3 secrets, 3 times the tiny plastic soldiers on this battlefield almost became the last ones standing. And at least once, maybe twice, only one person stood between us and the end. Let's start in 1983, because 1983 is the year the Cold War almost ended humanity's run entirely, and almost nobody realizes it. By the early 1980s, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a pitch that hadn't been seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The U.S. was deploying Pershing II ballistic missiles into Western Europe, missiles with a flight time to Moscow of about 6 minutes. 6 minutes from launch to impact, from a decision to an apocalypse. The Soviets were convinced, genuinely, deeply, institutionally convinced, that the Americans were planning a first strike, not as a hypothetical, as an imminent operational reality. Soviet intelligence had launched a massive surveillance program called Operation Ryan, specifically designed to detect the early indicators of an American nuclear attack. Indicators like unusual activity at military bases, sudden changes in the movements of government officials, the stockpiling of blood supplies at hospitals. They were watching for the tiny signals that would precede the end of the world. And then, on September 1st, 1983, a Soviet interceptor jet shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace. 269 civilians died. The international outrage was immediate and enormous. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. Relations between the superpowers went into freefall. The miniature battlefield was already soaked in gasoline. Someone was about to light a match. 3 weeks later, just after midnight on September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite detected something. 5 inbound ballistic missiles, American, headed for the Soviet Union. The alarm screamed. Every protocol said the same thing: reported up the chain, escalate, prepare for retaliation.
The entire Soviet nuclear doctrine was built on the assumption that in a real nuclear exchange, you would have minutes, maybe less, to respond before your own missiles were vaporized in their silos. You had to launch before the enemy's warheads landed. Use them or lose them. The officer on duty that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and something didn't feel right to him. The system said 5 missiles, but why 5? If the Americans were actually launching a first strike, the attack the Soviets had been dreading, the attack they'd built entire surveillance programs to detect, why would they send 5 missiles? 5 missiles wasn't annihilation. 5 missiles was a rounding error in a real nuclear exchange. It didn't make strategic sense. Petrov had 30 minutes to decide. In reality, he had seconds, because every minute he waited without reporting was a minute stolen from the Soviet response window. He picked up the phone. He reported a malfunction, a false alarm. He was right. The satellite had been confused by an unusual alignment of sunlight reflecting off clouds. There were no missiles. There was no attack. There was just one man in a concrete bunker, trusting his gut against every protocol he'd ever been trained to follow, and saving the world while doing it. Petrov was neither celebrated nor decorated. He was quietly reprimanded for not following proper reporting procedures. He retired. He lived the rest of his life in a small apartment outside Moscow. The world he saved never quite knew his name. Somewhere in this frozen little plastic diorama, a single toy soldier stood very still, and the whole board didn't explode.
But that wasn't the only moment, not even close. 2 months later, in November 1983, NATO launched one of the largest military exercises in its history, a command post simulation called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to rehearse the procedures for a nuclear release. It involved realistic message formats, radio communications, and a simulated transition from conventional to nuclear war. It was realistic, disturbingly realistic. The Soviets' intelligence was watching, and they became convinced, based on the communications they were intercepting, the activity they were monitoring, the patterns that matched everything Operation Ryan had told them to look for, that Able Archer wasn't an exercise at all, that it was real, that the Americans had disguised an actual first strike as a war game. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were placed on their highest alert. Fighter jets were loaded with nuclear weapons and put on standby. The KGB sent frantic cables to its stations in Western Europe. Watch for any signs that nuclear war is beginning, now, tonight. The world teetered on the edge of a misunderstanding. What pulled it back? Partly the fact that the Soviets ultimately concluded, correctly, that it was only an exercise. Partly because a British double agent named Oleg Gordievsky, who was secretly feeding information to MI6, had warned Western intelligence that the Soviets were genuinely terrified, not posturing, not playing games, genuinely scared that a strike was coming. That warning changed how NATO structured future exercises. It may have changed the outcome. Gordievsky never fired a weapon. He never commanded troops. He sat in offices and passed papers. But somewhere on this tiny battlefield, in a world made of green plastic and cigarette smoke and paranoia, a man with a briefcase was arguably the most important soldier of the entire Cold War. And then there's the darkest secret of all. The one that didn't fully emerge until the 1990s, when a former Soviet general named Vladimir Urinovich started talking. The Soviets built a system. They called it perimeter. The Americans, when they eventually learned about it, called it something more poetic, the dead hand. Here is how it worked. If Soviet leadership was destroyed, if a nuclear strike had decapitated the command structure, killed the president, silenced the generals, cut the communication lines, the system would automatically detect those conditions. Seismic sensors to register nuclear detonations on Soviet soil, radiation detectors, communication monitors watching for the sudden silence that would follow an attack.
If all of those conditions were met, if the world had gone dark and Moscow had gone quiet, then the dead hand would activate. Launch commands would be sent automatically to Soviet missiles, not through a human being, through the system itself. A dead man's switch for the entire planet. The Soviets built it because they were terrified of exactly what the Americans were planning, a decapitation strike, a surgical attack designed to kill Soviet leadership before they could respond. The dead hand made that strategy meaningless. You could kill every Soviet general, every politician, every officer with their finger on the button, and the missiles would still fly. There would always be a response, guaranteed, automated, unstoppable. When Western analysts finally confirmed its existence, the reaction was not admiration, it was something closer to existential vertigo. Because the dead hand didn't just guarantee Soviet retaliation, it guaranteed that the decision to end civilization would eventually be made by a machine reading sensor data in an underground bunker, that no future Stanislav Petrov, no human being with doubts and instincts and a gut feeling that something didn't add up, would be in the loop. The system was turned off, eventually, probably. Here's what the files, the defectors, and the declassified cables eventually revealed in total. The Cold War was not managed as carefully as history made it look. It was managed by terrified human beings making improvised decisions under impossible pressure. It was saved, more than once, by individual acts of judgment that violated established protocol. It was nearly ended by military exercises that looked too real, by satellites that misread sunlight, by intelligence agencies that had convinced themselves the other side was about to strike. And underneath it all, humming quietly in its underground vault, was a machine that had been given a simple and monstrous instruction. If everyone is dead, finish the job. The Cold War's darkest secret wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a battle, it wasn't a betrayal. It was the discovery that the two most powerful nations in human history had built a system, a whole invisible architecture of hair triggers and automated responses and worst-case assumptions that could end everything without either side ever making a conscious choice to do so. The plastic soldiers on this battlefield never moved. That's kind of the point. In the end, the scariest thing about the Cold War wasn't the armies, or the missiles, or the ideologies. It was how close we came to a world where no one was left to pick up the pieces, not even the plastic ones. Plastic Platoon, real wars, tiny soldiers, history that hits different.